My Life by Mazie Evans. I was born in 1893, 3 miles north of Palmer, Texas, I being the youngest of 9 children. My parents, Madison and Mary Epps, came in a covered wagon from Russellville, Arkansas to Texas. They were the parents of only 3 children at this time, and the other 6 of us were born in Ellis County near Palmer. My father bought a farm on which we all grew up, with the exception of 3 years where we lived in Hopkins County, south of Sulphur Springs. When I was 3 years old, I fell in a well, which was really a walled-up spring. This spring was where we dipped water to do our washing. My sister Della was just up from a siege of fever, but when she heard my scream, her strength came to her, and she ran from the house and pulled me out. I remember very well the dress I had on was a navy blue with white designs of little baskets. Mother put dry clothes on me and took me to my grandparents, William and Sophie McKeever, who lived a half-mile away. When we arrived there, they were chopping cabbage to make kraut. They were excited about my falling in the well, as the water was as deep as I was tall. On winter nights, after the chores were taken care of and supper was over, we formed a semicircle around the fireplace. Sometimes the older ones sang or read while I sat on Mother's lap. When I was 6 years old, I started to school in Palmyra, a two-teacher school, my sister Ollie being one of the teachers. I was so timid and afraid, it hurts. Most of the time, my father was a trustee. There were always 3 of them. I was very timid, but did very well in my reading and spelling. There was a well at the front of the school building, and the water was drawn by a rope and pulley. 2 cups were tied to the well curb, of which we all drank. Inside, at the back of the building, there were nails driven for us to hang our wraps and bonnets on. One side for girls, and the other was for boys. For heating, a big heater that burned wood in the center of the room. The teacher kept the fire going. The older pupils took turns keeping the building clean. This they did after the classes were over. On warm days, the windows were opened. School usually opened about November 1st, as the children had to help gather the cotton crop. On Friday, every other week, the afternoon was devoted to a program consisting of singing, speeches, and dialogue. My first was about my grandfather losing his spectacles, and I stood before the audience and recited with tears. I was so frightened. 3 of my sisters, Dora, Abby, and Della, had married by now, and they and their families lived nearby. My older brother, Rufus, had studied enough at home that he passed the exam and got a first-grade certificate and started teaching school. He also was a good student of the Bible. He memorized the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians while picking cotton. We always had a big garden, raising chickens, hogs, and cows. We milked cows, churned and made butter. By this time I was old enough to help work in the field, much to my dislike. I also helped around the house, such as drying dishes, bringing in stove wood, carrying water to the kitchen, picking berries, bringing fruit from the orchard, etc. Mother would have me churn, which seemed the longest, most tiresome of anything. There was a peddler who came by every so often, and Mother would trade him butter and eggs for materials to make our school dresses. If he arrived late in the day, we put him up for the night. The only holiday we observed was Christmas. Mother would cook a turkey, ham, and bake cakes and pies. We younger children, Ada and myself, hung our stockings, and Santa left apples, oranges, and candy. Also, at the community church, we would have 2 large Christmas trees, and the gifts were tied unwrapped to the branches. Then Santa would jump from behind the trees with a big ho ho and hand out little bags of candy to everyone. When I was 10, my parents and the part of the family who had not married moved to Hopkins County, where we had bought a farm. I walked a mile to school, which had no desks. We sat on long benches and put our books between us. I had a friend here that I enjoyed so much, and we remained friends until her death. At age 13, we moved back to Ellis County, to the same home we had left, but by now we owned a buggy and surrey. We attended church at Trumbull, 4 miles away, my parents going in the buggy and the rest of us in the surrey. When I was 14, I was baptized and was very happy. My father was a very quiet man, well liked by the community. He left most of the guidance of us children to Mother, who saw to it that we helped him in the field. When it rained and was too wet to be in the field, Father and the two boys, Rufus and Arthur, built fences, repaired harnesses, shucked corn, and so on. Mother and the girls sewed, pierced quilts, and so on. We attended church at Trumbull, 4 miles away, and in the summer, after crops were laid by, we had a 2-week meeting, which was always during canning season, so we canned through the day and attended church at night. And I was baptized. My sister Dora and her family moved to Brandon, 40 miles away, and Arthur and I made 2 trips to visit them. It was an all-day drive in the buggy. While they lived there, Dora passed away, leaving a husband and 4 children. Arthur and I attended 2 singing schools at Sylvania, a country church in another community. By now I had finished the grades at the country school and started to Palmer. I boarded in town from Monday through Friday. When I was 16, I had my first date. I so much wanted the boys to notice me, but I pretended I didn't, for fear that they would think I was forward. I graduated from high school in 1912, this being the first graduating class of Palmer. My sister Floy, who was next to the oldest sister, did so much for me. Mother's health had failed, so Floy took over the sewing, including making my clothes, and she went with me places that she was not interested in for herself. We slept together, and also she helped me with my lessons. We children hired out to pick cotton after all our own crop was gathered, and earned enough to buy a surrey with fringe around the top. Mother and Dad went to church in the buggy, and the rest of us in the surrey. Once in a while, there would be a party in the community, and we played snap, fruit basket turnover, and such. My father bought us an organ, but we didn't get to take lessons, so we learned to play by ear. After I finished high school, I went to Waxahachie and worked in a millinery store. I learned enough through the summer that I came to Dallas and worked a while. My expenses were more than my income, so I went back home. I picked cotton for a while, then sold Hurlbut's story, the Bible. I did very well at this, but in the meantime I had met Fincher Evans and had been dating him. He had a rubber-tired buggy, which very few had at that time. He came on Sunday afternoons and stayed for supper, and then pretty soon went home. Of course, we had been driving around with no special place to go. We were engaged that fall and married March 1st, 1914, at the Palmer Methodist Parsonage. When we married, he had brought me 13 boxes of chocolate candy. We came to Dallas on the Interurban and went to a show, Mutt and Jeff. We then boarded a train to Galveston, where we spent 2 days and nights. He, having lost his mother when he was 14 years of age, was living on a farm with his father. I moved in with them, and in less than a year, an 11-pound blue-eyed boy was born to us, to whom we named Ralph Lee. Then the following year, a black-haired girl, Marquita, was born. When she was 6 years old, we moved to Silverton, Texas, in the Panhandle, leaving Grandpa alone. We had a nice house to live in, a mile from town. My husband had traded some fishing equipment for a baby buggy, so I pushed the 2 babies to church on Sunday. There were about a dozen members, there being only 3 men, and none of them could lead singing. So I sat with the babies and started the songs. My husband didn't go to church, so sometimes he would have the churning done and the butter molded when we returned. We borrowed money from my mother and others and bought a half section of land which had no house except adobe. We bought a 2-room house and moved it in front of the adobe. We used the house for bedrooms, and the adobe was the kitchen. Now Ralph and Marquita were 4 and 3 years old. Windmills were our means of water, so we carried water from the pasture to the house. And once, when I was busy, Marquita got through the fence and was in the lane that led from the pasture to the watering tank. I saw the bunch of young mules coming at full speed to the tank and knew I could not possibly get to her in time. but I asked God to spare her, so the mules separated, some on each side of her, and left her sitting on the ground unharmed. While we lived here, we bought our first car, a Ford. Fincher taught me to drive. But the first trip alone, I was taking 5 dozen eggs to market, and when I reached town, they were grading the streets, which left a ditch on each side, which I didn't notice in time, and didn't slow up to cross it. So the car jumped in and out, breaking all my eggs. I had to return home without groceries, and with a terrific mess to clean in the car. Our main crop was wheat, and we had to have help. So a couple in a covered wagon came by looking for work, so my husband hired them. I saw a huge snake in the yard. I ran to get this lady to come and help me kill it. She came with her target and shot it, but it crawled to the stables. I got a pitchfork and stood on the fence and held it down while she beat its head off. When the men came in from work, they could hardly believe we had killed so big a snake, the lady being the one who did it, as I only helped. While we lived here, my husband had to make a trip to Tulia, 30 miles from home, and while he was gone, a blizzard blew up. We had about 50 head of stock, and I knew they must be fed in order to stand the weather. I put on a lot of clothes on body, head, and hands, and went out to throw bundles of maize. It was so bitter cold that I would run to the house after throwing 2 bundles and then back again. I thought I would never finish. When he came home next day, it had come a snow and some of our chickens were frozen to death. The snow had drifted as high as the fence in some places. We lived here and moved again, but kept this same place to farm. Our new home was west of Silverton, and I liked it much better. This was our best year, as we had rain enough to make a good crop, and no hail. It hailed quite a lot in the Panhandle. My husband stored the wheat in a barn 7 miles from home, and part of it was stolen. He hauled the rest by wagon to Tulia, as Silverton had no railroad. The price had gone down, so after all, we came out at the little end of the Horn. Here was where our third child was born, a blue-eyed boy whom we named Dell. My father-in-law was there at the time. He always visited us during the summer. He was a good man, and I enjoyed having him. My sister Ollie also visited us, as well as some friends from Palmer. I had heard of children being bitten by rattlesnakes and died before getting to a doctor. One afternoon I heard one rattle, and I screamed for the children to get out of the house. I was afraid to try to kill it, so we got a neighbor who was plowing near to come and kill it, as my husband was not home. We had a little orchard of apples and cherries here, and we were 20 miles from the canyon where wild plums were in abundance, so we made a yearly trip there to gather plums for jelly. Everywhere we lived on the plains, we had to go to Silverton for mail. No rural route, no daily paper, no phone. Also, church and school 5 miles away. Once, when Fincher needed to make a trip to Tulia, he took Ralph and Marquita with him. Baby Dell and I stayed home. The car broke down while they were there, and someone gave them a ride back to within 5 miles of home, so they walked the rest of the way. Marquita on her daddy's back, and Ralph, who was 5 then, trotted and kept up. While living at this place, we had an opportunity to lease a section of land and buy 75 head of white-faced cattle, all on credit. We moved again. Our nearest neighbor was a half-mile. This was just after World War I. We paid $75 a head for the cows, and within 2 months the Depression struck, and they were not worth hardly anything. My husband wanted to hold on to them, hoping things would get better. In the meantime, there was a drought, and the banks could not lend the farmer any more money for feed, so we let them go for $19 for cow and calf. We also had to let the lease go. My husband was a strong man and a very hard worker, but could not possibly make back the loss. We rented a small farm in the same community, but again, a drought. When there was not a drought, there was hail. Ralph was now 7 years old, and I had taught him through the 1st grade. We purchased a little pony named Rat for him to ride to school. And I was teaching Marquita at home, 1st grade. Ralph helped with the crop, driving a go-devil which they used instead of cultivators. He also earned enough to buy a small musical instrument, a horn which we ordered, and when it came the directions for playing, it blew away. He was almost heartbroken, and so was I. The last year we lived on the plains, our income was $150, which was from turkeys, as it took all the maize we raised to feed us and the stock. We had our hogs and chickens, and having a surplus of lard, I took it to the grocery store to exchange for other groceries, but they were oversupplied, so I took it back home. A neighbor and 2 children came to visit us, and I served cream gravy, biscuit, and cookies, as I had what I needed to cook this. No vegetables on account of the drought. While at this place, our crop netted us $150, which we used to get back to Ellis County. My mother had written us we could live with her and work her farm. It was the same farm I was born and reared on. We still had our car, but had not been using it because we could not buy gas. By now it had no top to it, but got it in shape to ride in. Having stored all our household things in one room so others could move in, we left. My husband was to return later to ship the things. We spent the first night in Childress and the next in Decatur. We arrived near Christmas time, and it seemed so good to be back where it was not so cold. Even a few roses were still in bloom. We moved in with my mother as she was alone. Our stock and household things arrived a month later, and we had to crowd my mother's furniture to make room for ours. For years we had been used to the wide open spaces and the roads so narrow. In Ellis County we had to switch from raising grain and cows to corn and cotton. Here we had an orchard of peaches, plums, and pears, which we canned, what we didn't use fresh. Also we cut peaches open and put them to dry. It took 3 days of sunshine to get them ready to store for winter. Then there was plum jelly to be made, also pear preserves. We raised hogs and chickens, so it took early rising to get each day's work done. Ralph and Marquita started to the same school that I attended when a child, except the old building had burned and the new one was built further away. My husband didn't want to live with my mother any longer, so we spent only 2 years here. My husband was very dissatisfied living with my mother, so he turned the farm back to her, but we had had a hard time finding another place. Finally, we moved to a farm in Dallas County between Hutchins and Lancaster, which was very poor land and didn't produce much. The house was the worst we had ever lived in. The children had 2.5 miles to walk to school. I again went out to sell books, but not much luck. While we lived here, 2 years the crops were very poor, and Fincher left for the oil field at Danacetta. He was there 3 weeks before he got a job. We made a trip down to see him, and Ralph drove all the way. He was 11 years old. We went in the T model Ford and had a number of flats on the way. We were there 2 days and nights, but had to get home as the children were missing school, and the neighbors taking care of our stock. At the end of the year, Fincher came home and moved us to Ferris, Texas, and pretty soon his work gave out in the oil field, so he had to come back to us with no job except to hire out for farm work. He and the children took their lunches each and did what they had apparently to do, and I worked for a Mrs. Smith who had a boarding house, so that way we got by. Wherever we lived, we attended church regularly and had friends. We had good health, and after all, poverty was not the worst thing that could happen to us. By now my mother had become feeble and could not keep up with the chores on the farm, so she and my brother moved to Palmer, the town nearest by, and we went back to her farm again. This time the children attended school at Trumbull, where there was only 10 grades. After they finished there, they went to school at Palmer, where Ralph and Marquita graduated. After they had finished school, a bus was put on to pick up those in the country, so Dell rode it to Ferris, where he was on the football team, and also graduated there. Ralph borrowed money and attended Trinity University of Waxahachie. Sue Farrar, whom he was dating, also attended there, and after he graduated and taught school a year, they were married. While we were still at this place, a baby boy, whom we named Dwain, was born with a club foot. We made many trips to Dallas to get his foot straightened. He wore a cast 6 weeks or more. Each time the cast was changed, they brought his little foot a little further around until it was straight, and when he was 13 months old, he walked. Then a little later, a baby girl, Faye, was born. She was healthy and smiled so much. Her daddy nicknamed her Smiles. We lived here 10 years. Then my mother died, and the place was sold, so we must move again. Our next move was to a 3-room house where we had rented 40 acres to put in cotton. When we went back to Ferris again and lived upstairs with a Mrs. Smith, the one I had worked for before, I helped her for our rent. In the meantime, Ralph had finished college and was teaching school and married. Marquita was working in Dallas, and Dell got work in Ferris at the A&P food store. While here, Marquita married and lived in New Mexico. Fincher got a day's work occasionally. We still had our milk cow and a big garden. When Mrs. Smith decided she wanted to charge us $15 a month rent, we moved to a house that we could get for $10. Even then, we could hardly keep the rent paid. About this time, because of the war, there had begun to be some jobs. My husband got work at North American, and we moved to Oak Cliff. By now, Dwain and Faye were in the 3rd and 4th grades. Ralph had gone to school at Denton and got his master's degree and taught at Marshall, Texas, a year, and then enlisted in the Air Force. This house sold, and we couldn't find one in Oak Cliff, so we moved to Grand Prairie for 5 months, then bought a house in Oak Cliff and moved to it. During these years, a depressing attitude had been building up in my husband's mind, but he kept working at North American until the war ended, which put him out of work again. This gave him a sick mind, which became worse and worse until one night, when Marquita and her husband were visiting us, he walked in and shot our son-in-law. He was taken to jail, where he stayed 8 months before having a trial. He was declared insane and sent to Terrell State Hospital for several years, and then they moved him to Rusk. After a few years there, 13 years at both places put together, he passed away. People were good to us. Dwain was 13 when his daddy left home, and he had just had surgery on both feet. The older 3 children were married. I worked in a hat factory until I was 68 and retired. We had lived at this home 16 years. Marquita had remarried, and also Dwain and Faye married. So I lived alone a number of years, then sold the home and moved to Fort Worth in an apartment that belonged to Ralph and Sue. This was for only 3 years as they sold their home and moved to Dallas, and I came at the same time. I always attended church wherever I lived, which was 8 different congregations.